Hello, I'm Kads, and welcome to today's video. So today we're going to be talking about my approach to the current iteration of the event dungeon, the battle against Odin Father. Initially, I wasn't sure how or if I was going to cover this particular dungeon, but after making my own team for the high stage, I was inspired to share it with you guys. And to not bury the lead here, I will say that my particular team is capable of farming stage 30, and it is an endgame team because that stage is most certainly meant for more endgame folks. But we're also going to talk about stage 20 and a couple of example teams that you guys might be able to recreate for yourself. So for starters, let's quickly go through Odin's kit because he is one of the champions, kind of like campaign champions, where they're a boss, but also they're a champion in the game. And so we can actually see their entire kit and their abilities and whatnot. So on the A1, attacks when an enemy has a 50% chance, books up to a 75% chance to place a berserk debuff for 2 turns, and this cannot be placed on bosses. So once he becomes available as a champion to get, you cannot place this debuff on bosses, but it can be placed on your champions in the boss encounter. Now what berserk does is it amplifies the amount of damage dealt and received by the target champion by, I believe, 50%. So you deal more damage, but you also take more damage. His A2, which I want to say is his bread and butter ability, is a full buff strip with a 100% chance to place the big version of decreased defense, as well as stunning all the enemies. And note, this is not actually an attack. This is kind of like a mesh between Madame Ceres and Armand's, and this is a very debilitating attack if it lands, but also it's highly susceptible to polymorph, so keep that in mind. Obviously, polymorph will not work against him in the boss encounter, but again, he will become a champion in the pool eventually. On the A3, he has a quite interesting ability where before attacking, he will steal all buffs from the target, and then he will deal an attack based on the target's type. It will ignore 100% defense, and if you're attack based, it'll deal based on your attack. Same thing for defense, and then HP support and bosses, it will be enemy max HP. So the important thing to understand about this ability is that it will be dependent on the current stats of your champion, meaning that if your attack based nuker has decreased attack on, their attack is reduced by 50%, this will do 50% less damage. Same thing if they have decreased defense on. So he actually reduces the damage you'll take for a defense type champion by using his A2 on you. So just keep that in mind, and if and when you happen to pull him and use him in PvP or PvE purposes. But despite all of that, the most important thing to understand when it comes to this guy as a boss is his passive, where every 9 turns it will place block damage on the champion for 1 turn, and it will also apply a buff spread effect, which will take all buffs from this champion and place them on all allies. So just bare minimum, he will spread block damage across his entire team, but anything he happens to have stolen from using the A3 will also be spread to all allies. So it's all buffs on him spread to all allies. So that can be very, very powerful and very, very dangerous depending on the situation. And then the aura is speed for void champions in arena battles with 40%. Very, very niche, but he's probably he's definitely going to be useful in the arena. So it might be very powerful or potent in that particular niche situation. And then of course, specifically as a boss, he has the pretty standard boss passive. So enemy max HP hits cannot exceed 10% of his max HP. He's immune to all CC debuffs. He's immune to turn meter dropping, locking of active skills, locking him out, etc. So now hopping over to the dungeon itself, let's talk about the best stages to farm. And I will most certainly give credit where credit is due that Saf from HH Gaming did an excellent breakdown in his video covering this. And what it boils down to is that if you want the best gear possible, then stage 30 is going to be your best bet in terms of quality. And then if you just want the best bang for your buck, best points per energy spent, the most efficient stage, just like all other core dungeons, it's going to be stage 20. I think stage 25 was kind of a middle ground where the energy switches from 18 to 20. But generally speaking, I think you're better off just doing stage 20 or stage 30, depending on your capabilities. Another reason I recommend watching his breakdown of it is because he also goes into the drop rates for each of the important stages. But I think the main takeaway is that despite having all the crappier gear sets in the dungeon, you're more likely to get pinpoint than anything else. And then once you roll for pinpoints, you're more likely to get accessories over artifacts. One quick note about progressing through the earlier stages. I do think for most people, the lowest of the low are very, very easy, and you kind of just one-shot the boss with any DPS. But depending on how developed your account is, it might be easier or harder to start progressing through these lower stages. For me, I was basically one-shotting him up until like stage 14, more or less. And then I actually had to start putting a bit more thought into compositions. And then when I got to stage 20 is where I actually started to iterate a little bit on putting a core team together. So let's start things off with stage 20 in the most accessible form, an epics only team. Fun fact, this was actually a challenge issued by my viewers on my latest Twitch stream last Saturday. Those take place every other week on Saturday mornings on my Twitch channel, which will be linked in the description box down below if you want to check those out in the future. But yeah, the challenge was to create a team that is epics only for stage 20, and this is what I came up with. It's a fairly standard composition, and I'll talk about what each of the champions do on this role. Deacon's pretty much keeping the engine of the team running. He provides AoE decreased defense, but more importantly, he's just a turn meter control champion with the speed aura. Ugo is once again one of the MVPs of the team because he is bringing the ever important block buffs, meaning that we can negate his passive as well as his ability to steal buffs, at least get the buffs that he steals. And then we have Doom Priest in the mix because her passive cleanses debuffs every turn, and so she can help us get rid of the decreased defense and or the stun. After that, we pretty much just have 2 DPS champions champions. I brought in Husk for his enemy max HP hit, and then I brought in Magnar, who's just one of the best epic HP based nuker in the game. So combined, they can help us kill the minions, and then they can also start DPSing down the boss himself. And I guess it's also worth noting that the boss initially doesn't have any minions, but as you progress through the stages, he starts to get minions by his side, which are just other champions in the game. And as we play through these teams, I would talk about which ones are the most important to worry about. Let's go ahead and see this team in action against the boss. So I've kind of already explained exactly how it works. There's not anything crucial going on here in terms of AI overrides, but we have block buffs out there. So whenever the 9 turns across your team and the enemy team occurs, then we're just fine and dandy to go and not get or not deal with his passive ability. So there we go, he does his big ability, not a big deal. We have Doom Priest coming in to cleanse. Note that Doom Priest can only cleanse one ability or one debuff at a time, so it's not going to be perfect every time as far as getting rid of the stun and the decreased defense, but the whole point is that, you know, for the most part, for most of the time, she's actually going to get rid of things. So unlucky there, he took a couple of turns and got rid of the block, or got the block buffs fell off, but again, that can happen because we're not perfectly dodging the stun every single time. Again, this is meant to be your first iteration, or you're the most unlucky player in the world and you have no good legendaries or anything for this game. This is for this boss, excuse me. So this is meant to act as a proxy for that situation where you just happen to not have any helpful legendaries for this particular fight. I think that's horrendously unlikely, but nonetheless, you could be that 1% of the player base that is just horrendously unlucky. So there we go, stuns us again, and we lose a turn, but it's fine. Doom Priest cleanses off what she can, and this time looks like we're better maintaining block buffs. So again, I would say the minion that you have to worry about for the lower stages is, I think, Ayala Life Braid or something like that. She has a pretty massive heal on one of her abilities, which is very annoying, just because when you heal like bosses and enemy mobs, it can be pretty massive, just as a percentage, because they have millions of health. So she's the one to watch out for. And I think Ator here on the left-hand side, his passive can place counterattack, and so it can slow down your run, but it can also just be he can provoke on his A1, which is very annoying. So if you don't have enough resistance, it could definitely be a problem. So there you go, epics only, takes about 2 minutes. We happen to get some bad RNG there with block buffs falling off a couple of times, so there's a couple of turns where he was immune to damage. But nonetheless, the main thing to highlight here is that we were at no risk of dying. Everyone stayed alive and relatively high health the entire time. We have a couple of healers on the team between Ugo and Doom Priest, on top of the leech from the A1 of Deacon, which also helps heal up the DPS. But also in this case, we're not using squishy DPS, right? They're kind of both HP based, and so that helps them stay alive a little bit better. Before we move on, a couple more important things about stage 20 in and of itself. The accuracy requirement you need is somewhere around 200 or so it's nothing ridiculous. It's pretty much on par with the existing core dungeons. And I would say that a really solid alternative to Doom Priest in this particular composition is actually Hoskrul, an epic, a previous fragment summon epic, but an epic nonetheless. But he also has an ability that can remove all the stuns from all your allies, so as long as he's the top of, or the fastest on your team, he can also serve that role as far as cleansing the stun. You'll still have the decreased defense on, but that's not as big of an issue as missing your turn to the stun. So level 2 of this team for stage 20 is using more champions that you should probably have once you've been playing for an amount of time. We're still keeping in Husk for the same job. We still have Ugo for the exact same job, but instead of Doom Priest, we're bringing in Mithrala Lifebrain, who you can get from Hydra, of course, and she is going to serve as our cleanser for the decreased defense and the stun. She is the fastest on this team, or nearly the fastest on this team. And then we're bringing in a little more powerful DPS in the form of Sun Wukong, who you should still be able to get from a promo code in the early game, and Ninja, who you should still be able to get from a promo code, at least at the time of this recording. So let's go ahead and see this version of the team in action. There's nothing too crucial about this team either in terms of AI overrides, but we do want to make sure that Mithrala saves her cleanse for after the boss goes, so we delay that by 1 turn by starting off with the A2. Wukong basically one-shots all the mobs, and then Ninja and Husk start dealing damage to the boss. Here he goes with the strip and the decreased defense, and then Mithrala comes back around and cleanses. So now they're basically in sync, and so we don't have to worry about anything, and then we're basically just a DPS fight on the solo boss. Other thing to note about bringing in Wukong for this particular fight is that he can kind of be your backup or even your primary block buffs champion, because he obviously steals buffs on his A3, and then he also places block buffs before attacking. So he can most certainly do both roles if you happen to not have Ugo, but you do have Wukong. And there you have it. Yeah, much faster than the other team. Obviously, we're bringing in a lot more powerful champions that are a little bit more robust, have a little bit more damage, and we'll show the builds for all these champions later on. But the main takeaway is that with a core of Mithrala and Ugo, basically the dungeon is covered, and then you can can bring in whoever you have as DPS to both deal with the minions as well as deal with the boss. Now for stage 30, this is a completely different animal, and yes, you can see that we're using 3 mythicals. Oh my god, super pay to win, broken team, unfair, how can I ever do this? But when you actually break down the roles of each champion on the team, it can be a lot more simplified than you might think. So at this point, the boss and the minions have a lot more HP, so it's a lot harder to just straight up DPS them down by one-shotting, unless you have some really god tier champions in gear, which I most certainly do not have. And so we're switching over our primary form of DPS over to HP burn and HP burn activation, and that is in the form of Gizmak on my account. But honestly, that role could be done just as easily by like a Walking Tomb Drang or even an R-Tac. Walking Tomb Drang would be nice because he requires no accuracy, so you don't have to worry about the 500 accuracy requirement for the stage, but R-Tac would of course require accuracy to be able to place his HP burn. Lady Mikage is technically an accessible champion, but obviously the amount of time it'll take to get her will be highly dependent on your RNG for getting the epics and the rares required. But her job on this team, as well as Star Stage Galathir, believe it or not, is just using both of their alternate forms, and they're just using their hard CC abilities. So we have both of them having the capability to stun, and then Galathir also has the ability to place block active skills, which of course doesn't work on the boss. Neither of those no CC works on the boss, but they do work on the minions. So we're preventing the minions from doing what they would do, which is very nasty, but also kind of just chain CCing them. But if you don't have both of those champions, it's not the end of the world, because again, their roles is just hard forms of CC. So that could be provoking, could be stunning, could be whatever you have. You just need 2 form. At least I think it's best if you want this type of team. Obviously you could use some sort of seer, explosion type, maximum DPS types teams. We're not going to talk about that in this particular video, but that is most certainly something that is out there as a strategy. For this team though, we're using a control and burn strategy. Ugo is doing the exact same thing she's done in all the other teams. She's providing decreased defense and block buffs. And then Riho Bone Spear is kind of an interesting choice. So because the boss only applies debuffs, or typically the order of his abilities, he applies debuffs with his A2, the AoE decreased defense and stun. That's the first thing he does to Riho, and her passive actually reflects it back to the boss. Obviously he can't be stunned, but it does reflect the decreased defense. But more importantly, it just prevents her from being stunned, and thus she's free to cleanse everyone else, heal them up, and then place block debuffs, which protects us from everything else the boss can do, including the Berserk debuff, and then anything else the minions might try to do. And speaking of the minions, they can be very, very annoying. Turvold is Turvold, so if he gets a lot of buffs on him from the boss's passive, and he starts to use his Berserk ability, or whatever it's called, he can most certainly start one-shotting your team depending on how squishy they are. Ursuga Warcaller is an HP-based champion in an enemy wave, which means that her HP is super, super high, so she does a ton of damage even without critting, so she can most certainly start one-shotting people, which is kind of ridiculous. Valkyrie is annoying because of her passive, so she's going to start pushing back your turn meter if you start buffing a little bit too much, which is something you just have to account for if you're running some sort of speed tune teamed. The more you buff, the more she's going to push your turn meter back, which might let the mobs and or the boss start to lap your team. And then Dunelord Gregor was the most underrated champion on the composition that I honestly didn't understand exactly what he did, but he has like a passive where he can allow anyone and everyone on the team, as long as they're barbarians of course, to ignore a lot of your resistance, which makes it harder to deal with some of the mechanics of, again, if they start to snowball and start getting turns. But more importantly, he has like a, if you hit him, he can place provoke on you, which can, you know, waste your turns. And then he also has this ridiculous ability where he can partially reset the cooldown of abilities, and so Odin can start to get out of sync with his normal skill rotation if he starts getting turns. On top of that, the boss himself, he also has 6-star lightning cage as well as temporal chains, so the more buffs you have out, the slower your team will be. And lightning cage of course makes it harder to strip buffs once he has them up, so that again, block buffs is a lot more important. All right, so let's go ahead and see this super free-to-play friendly, totally not pay-to-win team in action. One thing I forgot to mention is that Riho Bone Spear's job could technically be done by Mithrala, just like on the stage 20 teams, but it's a little bit less reliable when dealing with the provoke potential from the Dunelord Gregor, as we just saw. Even my high resistance Galathir is still susceptible to the provoke. So there we go. He places the stuns, and it's not speed tuned perfectly that Riho is the fastest on this team, but nonetheless it does enough work to prevent us from missing the turn after that. And so you can see there, HP burn doing a ton of work. Pretty much all the damage. He's the only, Gizmak is the only DPS on the team. HP burn just chunking them, and again, we're staggering and stacking the CC from Lady Mikage as well as Galathir. There's a little bit of turn meter control as well from Galathir specifically, and Mikage, in fairness, a lot of her abilities do place or do decrease turn meter, but once again, that is not something that affects the boss. He's also immune to decreased speed, so Gizmak cannot slow him down. He's also immune to turn meter decrease, as we just saw blocked right there. So now, once we get into the second rotation, just because of Valkyrie's passive pushing all of her turn meters back, eventually we get into the perfect cycle where, especially after Valkyrie dies, we get locked locked into the cycle, where essentially we don't have to worry about him stunning us, and Rehab is perfectly tuned by happenstance to end up exactly where she needs to. So there you go, stage 30 in about a minute or so. This is not the fastest team by any means, but it is most certainly a serviceable team for the duration of this dungeon's existence. And I'll once again reiterate that in this composition, yes, we are using very, very powerful champions, mythicals to be more specific, but the core concept of the double control, deal with the debuff stability, block buffs, and then some form of DPS, in this case I'm opting for AoE HP burn and activation, is something that you could potentially translate to some different champions you may have on your account, and if not, then stage 20 is perfectly fine to farm with a lot simpler of a team. So now let's go through the builds on the champion showcased across all of these teams. Starting off with Magnar, who's in Savage and then one piece of Stone Skin for the little bonus of HP. You can see his chest piece isn't even maxed, but nonetheless he does enough for the team composition. HP 90,000 there, 2,700 on the defense, 179 on the speed. He does have HP percentage boots, so that's why he's so slow. Full crit rate, 215 on the crit damage, so nothing crazy or insane there. Don't care about the accuracy or resistance. He has Crushing Rend, it's 1-star blessing, but if I happen to get a 6-star soul for him, then it would be a lot more powerful, but I digress. And then for the masteries, he's built like a nuker, so we're focusing on the first hit type of masteries on the offense tree, ultimately ending on Helm Smasher to ignore more defense, and then we're mixing that with a little bit of the defense tree. Probably I would end on Retribution, but I decided not to finish his out because I got better champions who can do his job better, and so I didn't actually feel the need to finish out his masteries. Next up, we have Doom Priest, who's built in Relentless and Divine Speed, and she is most certainly in like leftovers when it comes to Relentless gear. She's not in my best set by any means. Her total stats are as follows: 57,000 on the HP, 3,600 on the defense, 258 on the speed, and then a fairly serviceable amount of resistance, 372. Granted, her gear isn't fully maxed in terms of the accessories. Notably, she's unbooked, so you don't really need her. She's in there just exclusively for the passive, and Relentless just helps her get her passive off more often. And then for the Blessing, Miracle Heal, just because she heals on her passive, and so she has a chance to restore destroyed max HP in certain fights where you have to deal with that. And then Masteries, not done, because she doesn't really need them. She's not on any of my core teams, and so I didn't even get even T1s. Next up, we have Deacon Armstrong, who's in Speed, and Perception. So he's kind of like in an arena-ish build, but he's not one of my primary arena champions. He's just kind of on the side. He's most certainly another champion who's a victim of hand-me-down gear, but I digress. 57k on the HP, 3,700 on the defense, 271 on the speed. So once again, nothing crazy. Then 480 on the accuracy. He's indexed high on the accuracy and speed. For the Blessing, happened to be lucky enough to get a 5-star soul, and like I always do for my decreased defense champions, AoE, I put cruelty on them to help them do their job slightly better, and obviously he cycles through his abilities very quickly. For the masteries, pretty much standard debuff for masteries, par for the course. Offense tree, hugging the left hand side, ultimately ending on War Master. Getting more PvE build is where he initially came from, even though now he's more arena focused. And then the support tree is hugging the right hand side of the support tree, ending on Sniper and Master Hexer. Next up, we have Husk, who's also in Relentless gear and Perception. He is built for Nightmare Hydra Clan Boss, or Nightmare, or just Hydra Clan Boss in general, but specifically on my team, or on my account, he's built for Nightmare in terms of the accuracy requirements. HP 72,000, defense almost 3,000, 233 on the speed, full crit rate, and 209 on the crit damage. Once again, nothing crazy. 380 on the accuracy, so a little bit low, but with the Hydra bonuses or whatever from the Super Great Haul, it gets him above to where we need to be, around 400 or so. For the Blessing, once again, hoping to eventually get a 6-star soul by luck. He's sitting at Crushing Rend, and I just don't want to pay the gems to swap it later on. And then for the Masteries, more of a DPS PvE type build. So the offense tree hugging the left-hand side, ultimately ending on War Master. Again, he's a PvE champion, so we're just getting bonus damage. And then defense tree getting a little bit of Harvest to spare. So if I use him in wave content, when he stuns, he has a chance to place Leech, but anything else is just reducing damage he takes. Ninja, in a very similar fashion, is in Relentless and Perception as well, and his total stats are as follows: 43,000 on the HP, 4,600 on the attack, pretty low on the defense, 1,800, 237 on the speed, full crit rate, 238 on the crit damage, and then 323 on the accuracy. For the Blessings, I opted for Brimstone. 1-star is basically good enough, unless it's a boss that cleanses. And then for the Masteries, once again, pretty standard debuff for Masteries. Granted, we deviate a little bit. We do ultimately end on War Master, of course, for the T6 on the offense tree, but it did come down to Cycle of Violence in case I use him in sort of waves or lower HP targets, where you might have a chance to reduce the cooldown of the Hail Burn ability. And then support tree, picking up the accuracy stuff along the way to Sniper and Master Hexer. Next up, we have my son, Nukong, in Savage and Perception. perception. His total stats are as follows: 47,000 on the HP, 6k on the attack, one of the most important champions on my account, I might note, 2,200 on the defense, 248 on the speed, full crit rate, 262 on the crit damage, and 323 on the accuracy. In terms of the blessing, I opted for Soul Reap, just for the chance for the Soul Reaper to finish off anyone that his A2 does not finish off in and of itself. And then for the masteries, he is most certainly built like a nuker, but a little bit of a deviation to pick up Opportunist because he does have a stun on his A1. So if he happens to stun a target, then he can deal 12% more damage, but we're ultimately ending, of course, on Helmet Smasher to increase the damage he does. And then Support Tree, kind of picking up as much accuracy stuff along the way and ultimately ending on Spirit Haste, because if people are dead and he revives himself, he goes a little bit faster. Thrall Lifebane, who's built for the arena in Perception and Untouchable with the lovely 5-star blessing from the Titan event. Her total stats are as follows: 78,000 on the HP, 4,700 on the defense, 272 on the speed, and then 700 on the accuracy with 279 on the resistance, which means her effective resistance is basically over 1,000. For the blessing, I opted for temporal changes because it helps us cut in on faster teams and deal with any CC that they might have put out there. And then for the masteries, we're indexing as much as possible into the accuracy side of the support tree, ultimately ending on Eagle Eye. And then defense tree, we're kind of taking a weird route, but we're pivoting over through some of the more tanky stats, but also boosting our resistance when we place buffs, and she does place a lot of buffs. And then, of course, ending on Retribution for the counterattack with the poisons. Next up, we have Ugo, the MVP for so many areas in the endgame in Relentless and Perception, 5-star blessing as well with some good fortune. Now, with this fight in mind, I did have to rebuild her recently to crank up her accuracy to the appropriate threshold, which is again is over 500. And so her total stats are as follows: 82,000 on the HP, 3,200 on the defense, 275 on the speed, and then 523 on the accuracy. Obviously, she's getting a lot of benefit from the blessings and empowerment, so I fully acknowledge that is helping, but nonetheless, that's still the target threshold you need to target. And Relentless is most certainly not required, but I do also use her in Hydra Clan Boss, so it helps her take more turns and maintain block buffs in that encounter. For the blessing, obviously I went with Miracle Heal because when we're talking about Hydra, they destroy the head decay, destroys max HP, so it just helps her restore it when the head is alive, but more importantly when the head is dead. And the masteries, fairly standard debuff for masteries, left-hand side of the offense tree down to War Master, right-hand side of the support tree down to Sniper and Master Hexer. Rehill Bone Spear, who honestly you guys probably haven't seen that much because she's on very, very niche teams like my Phantom Shogun's Grove, but double perception and then some offset pieces which just happen to give her some fairly useless stats. It was mostly for the substats on those two pieces. But her total stats are as follows: almost 70,000 on the HP, 3,200 on the defense, 285 on the speed, which is around where you need it to be for stage 25 of the Phantom Shogun's Grove, and then 500 on the accuracy, again for both of these boss encounters. For the blessing, I did opt for Brimstone just like Ninja. Ideally, she would be a 5-star along with him just for the bosses that can cleanse themselves and whatnot, but I digress. For the masteries, fairly standard debuff for masteries, at least for the offense tree, we're coming down the left-hand side, ultimately ending on War Master. But for the support tree, we have enough accuracy, so I didn't really need to go all of the accuracy stuff, but we're boosting the amount of healing she does by coming down the left-hand side and getting lasting gifts, but also because she places a lot of debuffs, we're making sure to pivot all the way down to Master Hexer as well. Next up, we have Star Sage Galathyr, my resistance powerhouse on my account, who's in resistance, perception, and 2-piece stone skin, which is effectively a resistance set. Total stats are as follows: 84,000 on the HP, 3,300 on the defense, 303 on the speed. Finally got his boots to reroll into speed, so that's why he's finally above 300. 664 on the resistance, and then almost 300 on the accuracy. For the blessing, there isn't one, so we're still hoping that will happen one day. And then for the masteries, we're indexing more into the resistance with Unshakable. We're going the anti-Siffy route here by going on to Wisdom of Battle to try and not get stuck in a loop of perpetual sleeps. And then for the support tree, a little bit of the accuracy stats, but ultimately ending on Master Hexer for the block active skills, extending that, and then Spirit Haste because he is a reviver on Form 1. Gizmak the Terrible is in Relentless and crit damage. He's primarily built for PvE, but he also serves a purpose in PvP for melting through some stone skin. And Form 1, which is where I usually keep him, his stats are as follows: 68,000 on the HP, 2,600 on the defense, 267 on the speed, full crit rate, a little bit of crit damage at 185. And then I've indexed into resistance 441, primarily for PvE, but it also benefits him by dodging a lot of champions with low accuracy, but high levels of polymorph. Indexing a little bit more into his arena side focus, I went with the Incinerate Blessing to to increase the power of his HP burn activation against Stone Skin. And then for the masteries, they are more PvE focused, with the offense tree hugging the left hand side, ultimately ending on War Master, and then using the defense tree because we don't really need any accuracy as long as you have full crit rate in his kit. So a little bit of tanky stats, a little bit more resistance, and then retribution to potentially counter with the A1 and extend HP burns. And then lastly, we have Lady Mikage in double speed and perception, the fastest champion on my account currently, and her stats are as follows: 74,000 on the HP, 4k on the defense, 357 on the speed, and then 562 on the accuracy. For the blessing, just like Mithrala, I opted for temporal change, which just helps us cut in against speed teams and potentially be able to swap forms and stun the enemies. Notably, she is not booked on her form 1 yet, but I think I finally have enough tomes, so we'll wait for the next CVC in order to do that. And then the masteries, indexing more onto the accuracy side of things, with ultimately ending on Eagle Eye for the support tree, and then going once again the anti-Siphi route into the defense tree by making sure to pick up Wisdom of Battle, and then getting Retribution to counterattack, as well as Cycle of Revenge. So there you have it. That is my team that I'm going to be using for stage 30 whenever I feel the need to farm this boss, but we also showcased a couple of more accessible teams that you could use for the easier stage that is stage 20. Let me know in the comment section down below if you're even interested in farming this dungeon in order to get pinpoint gear and accessories. And of course, please do share the team that you're going to be using and the stage you're running it on. As always, if you did find this video helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below. It really does help out the channel. And if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to subscribe to the channel for more content just like this one in the future. Thanks for watching and have a good one.